Have you ever imagined what a scientist looks like? Today's guest is going to be someone who I don't think you're going to ever imagine. And that is because he is low vision. And what on earth does that mean? I'm going to let him explain this to you. But when I met him, I just knew that he was almost blind, and yet he was in a lab performing research, which is frankly amazing. So I'm delighted to introduce you to a close friend of mine, Dr. Mahadeo Sukhai, and he's going to tell me all about what it's like being a low vision scientist. And we're going to move into things all about DEI, which he is very, very experienced in. So I'm delighted that he's joining me today. And this is going to be a series of videos. So please join me for all of them. I'm Kate. I'm the founder of Educated STEM. And normally we talk about the personal and professional development of people going into graduate school and postdocs. But frankly, anybody could go into those areas if you have the support. And so if you are disabled or neurodivergent or anything like that, then I hope that this series of videos that I'm going to do will encourage you to think broadly about moving into STEM. So thank you, Mahadeo, for joining me.
Thank you so much, Kate, for having me.
Okay, so I've known Mahadeo for a very long time. I actually met him 14 years ago through the National Postdoctoral Association. And eventually we both served on the board together. And he obviously stands out as literally the only person I know in science who is low vision. So Mahadeo, what does that mean?
14 years. Oh my goodness. Okay. So let's unpack low vision as a term. I think everyone has sort of a presumption about the word blind. And the presumption that a lot of folks have is, well, okay, blind means cannot see. But one cannot see as a matter of degrees, right? So let's if we think about how the eye works, and we think about how the signal from the retina gets transduced to your visual cortex via the optic nerve, there's a bunch of dimensions of what we call eyesight. And the funny thing is, the eye is, in effect, it's the machinery of vision, but it's actually not the processor of vision. The processor is in the brain. And there's a saying that I'm fond of actually using, and that is, it's actually the brain that sees, it's not the eye that sees. The eye is the light collector, the eye is the microscope, the eye is the telescope, the eye is the camera, but the processor is actually sitting inside the brain. So when we think about functional eyesight, when we think about vision, there are quite a few dimensions of that. One of those dimensions is the one that we are typically accustomed to when we go to an optometrist or an optician or an ophthalmologist, and we are using the eye chart, and what we're asked to do is read the letters on the lowest line that we can reasonably make out. Now, for me, that's the first line. For most of you, it's like the 6th, 7th, 8th, and so on. And so the thing that we're measuring when we do that is actually called acuity, which is effectively how much detail we are able to resolve. But then, in addition to detail, you can have things like visual field. So our eyes are collecting light from what's roughly about 200 degrees of a circle, and that's 100% of a visual field. And so one can measure how much of that people are actually able to interact with. And then we have contrast, and being able to resolve things that are high contrast and low contrast. So that's the third dimension of vision. Then we have color, which is a fourth dimension, and brightness, which is a fifth dimension. And so color, it's not just do we perceive all the colors of the rainbow, it's do we perceive them all in a manner that we can all reasonably agree upon. So wavelength 550 nanometers, is that going to be yellow for everybody? Right? For some people, it might not be, and they might perceive that wavelength in a different way, but because the rest of us call it yellow, they'll call it yellow, and no one will know that they're actually seeing something slightly different than what others might be seeing. So you've got brightness, you've got color, you've got contrast, you've got detail, you've got acuity, you've got depth, because the eyes themselves are stereoscopic in nature. We have two eyes, and so we're supposed to integrate the images from the two eyes in order to see stereoscopically. That allows us to perceive depth. And so right there are dimension number 6 and dimension number 7, and then there's an 8th dimension, which is black and white, right? And so all of those different portions of vision make up seeing. So when we say low vision, people always come to me with the question, so how much can you see? And then if I really wanted to be pedantic, and if I really wanted to give a biology lesson, I would actually go through the exercise that I just did, which is say, well, it really depends on which dimension of vision you're talking about. And so in my particular case, I suck at contrast, and I suck at depth, and I suck at detail. Right. And so some of those things are attached to other things. So because I suck at contrast, my night vision is not great, which means black and white resolution for me is not great. And so those things are sort of related to one another. Because I suck at stereoscopic, I suck at depth, right? So I can't do depth perception, which also means I can't resolve stereoscopic images. There's 2 of everything, right? And so those things are interconnected with one another. But I have a full visual field, and my perception of color is pretty, I'm going to say pretty sort of meat and potatoes, like a lot of other people's perception of color. I don't have a perception of wavelengths that's different from what most of the human population has as perception of wavelengths. So from a physiology perspective, there's some functional dimensions of my vision that are very distinct, and there are others that are relatively consistent with most other human beings. And so when you ask, well, how much do you see? The answer is it varies. Are we talking about detail, or are we talking about visual field, or are we talking about something else? The other aspect of vision, as I said, is it's not just about the physiology of the eye. It's also about the processing of the brain. And so an interesting, rather cool piece of science that I learned about that explains so much about me is this. So using functional magnetic resonance imaging, when you scan the visual cortex of babies who are born with a degree of vision loss, that degree of vision loss is actually not corrected before the age of 6 months. Then the visual cortex actually goes and does its own thing, not called vision. And so babies, when they're born, are actually quite functionally blind. And babies develop eyesight, they develop acuity, they develop focus and tracking and all sorts of other things. They develop those things by the age of 6 months. Now, if for whatever reason there's a physiological issue or a neurological issue that prevents that development, and that is not something that can be corrected or is not corrected before the age of 6 months, and then the visual cortex goes off and does its own thing. And that's not necessarily a retrainable phenomenon. So the brain is pretty plastic, but it's not so plastic that the visual cortex will go back and do the thing that it's supposed to do if it's been a while. And so I was born with something pretty unusual called congenital cataracts. And you go and you look up the statistics, you'll find that congenital cataracts will be prevalent in about 1 in 10,000 births in North America. But that's great. I wasn't born in North America, though, so put that to one side. But then the other thing is they're measuring any kind of cataract. So no matter how extensive the cataract is, and in my case, I had complete cataracts in both eyes. So I literally could not see anything for the first 16 months of my life until those lenses came out. And so as a result, my visual cortex has gone and done other interesting things with itself. And there are functional consequences that are actually neurological that are associated with that. So in the hypothetical world where I actually got lens implants, which is not something I can get for a whole host of other reasons, but in that hypothetical world, we still would not actually adjust or correct the neurological changes in my visual processing that mean that I don't do 3D very well. In terms of processing, I don't do facial recognition very well. I don't do biological objects in 3D very well. And And there's a few other neurological things that are associated with the contrast and associated with the depth, that mean that even if we could physiologically correct my eyesight, we're not going to neurologically correct it. And so that complicated neuroscience and eye physiology lesson to say that when we talk about low vision, it's not a one size fits all. Here's a single metric. Let's use it to explain percentage of remaining eyesight. But rather, it's very complex and very multidimensional. And somebody like myself, I see things, but somebody else who is low vision, who might have the same acuity as I do, might see different things.
Okay, that was a lot. That was that was not what I was expecting.
You asked for the biology lesson.
No, it's cool. I just learned so much. But now I'm wondering, because whenever we hang out, you know exactly who I am. But if you say that you don't recognize faces, is that my voice?
It's your voice.
Oh,
It's
see?
it's your voice and the fact that I have known you for 14 years. And so I have been able to pick up on the subliminal cues of Kate, right?
Okay, very interesting.
That
Who
that holds for people I've known for a long time. So if I'd only known somebody for like 6 minutes, then I wouldn't know it's them in a networking session, right? So if I meet a random postdoc at a networking event, or say I attend the next NPA conference, and somebody decides to come over after I've given a talk and introduced themselves, I will not remember them at dinner,
Oh. Well,
right?
I guess I should be grateful that I stuck.
Yeah. So funny story related to that, in fact. So my very first conference that I attended was back in 2000. It was the American Society of Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics. It was in Los Angeles, as a matter of fact. It was the first time I ever went to LA. And it was March of 2000, and I was a year and a half into my master's and presenting two posters that arose from the work that I'd done to that point in my master's. And I had this wonderful conversation for about 15 minutes with a gentleman who'd come to view my posters and chat with me. And of course, I couldn't read his name tag because I don't have that level of detailed vision, and name tags are atrocious for reading purposes generally. Most people don't know how to make them right. And so I had this 15-minute conversation with him, and he clearly knew me by name, which I figured was because he could read my name tag. And at the end of it, I said, may I get your name? And he looked at me, and I could tell the annoyance was oozing off of him with that question of mine. May I get your name? He said, I'm on your thesis advisory committee. And I
Ooh.
just wanted to melt into the floor. Because I had only met him in person once before that particular event, and that was at a committee meeting that I had in June of 1999. So I'd never seen this person since June of 1999 to March of 2000. I was so embarrassed. And so that's an example of how you might come up to me and think that you're memorable, and I might have no idea who you are.
But I mean, surely he knew that you were low vision, so
I
he
don't
might.
think, yeah, but the thing is, I don't think he understood what that meant. And so it's one of those things where there's a whole suite of activities that functionally I'm able to do that are no different from, say, what you are able to do, right? And in terms of things like data analysis, and in terms of things like planning an experiment, and in terms of things like making like all sorts of scientific activities, all sorts of daily activities, not science, I can do those things the same way a lot of other people can. Maybe there's some functional nuance that I'm doing that's different from how you're doing it, but for the most part, we get to the same end goal. And as it turns out, most people care that we can get to the same end goal, and they don't really care that the method that we're taking to get there might be subtly or grossly different. But then there's a whole bunch of other things that I can't do quite the same way, right? And because there's all these things that I can do, and all these things that require significant workarounds in order to be able to do them. And it's not, it's again, it's not one size fits all. I don't need significant workarounds to do everything. I need workarounds to do some things, and some of those workarounds are more significant in some places than in others. It's very situation dependent and very context dependent. And as a result, I tend to find that people get thrown because what they're expecting is, and I'll use a non-scientific example. I'll use the example of navigating just for a moment. So I can navigate perfectly well in my neighborhood, independently without needing any assistance. I can probably navigate reasonably well just because of the number of times I've been through the airport. Toronto's Pearson International Airport very well because I travel regularly, and I've gotten to know the airport as the airport's evolved over the last 20 something years. But then every time I come to LAX, right? You know, I find that because it's been a while since I've come to LAX, usually once a year, then it takes some degree of reorienting and refamiliarizing before I figured out what's what and who's who and where's where. Right. And the last time I came to LAX, I think I flew, what did I fly? Was it Porter? I think I flew Porter, which was a different terminal than the Air Canada terminal. Right. So I had a different experience the last time I flew into LAX than I had the time before. And so nighttime, low contrast, unfamiliar settings, right, are where I tend to rely on either assistance from a person, and you've cited guide from me before, so you understand what I mean when I say that, or I bring out the cane. But daytime, high contrast settings and more familiar settings, I don't bother with the cane, right? Because I know the space, and I'm able to figure out how to get around. So sometimes um, sometimes I will use an aid, sometimes I won't use an aid, and that is a nuance about my lived experience with low vision that's different than some others, because some folks I know who live with low vision will always use, for example, a guide dog, or will always use their white cane, right? Or will always use screen magnification, or will always use text to speech. But I don't. There are scenarios in my life where I need those things, and scenarios in my life where I don't need those things. And as somebody who was born blind, and as somebody who was offered those assistive aids and devices and tools from when I was in school, I also recognize that if you use those things as a kid in school, you immediately flag yourself as different. And you immediately open yourself up to all sorts of schoolyard bullying. And since I wasn't into that, I picked and chose my moments, right? And I continue to pick and choose my moments based on what I need and when I need it, right? So it is not functionally, it is not a one size fits all. And how that means in terms of my interaction with the world is also not one size fits all. So unfortunately, I think what ends up happening is, because I don't always use the magnifier, I don't always use the audio, I don't always use the cane. Sometimes I will have someone, and this has actually worked to my disadvantage, I think, quite a few times. Sometimes I'll have someone who will think about me in such a ways such that, yeah, he's low vision, but he doesn't actually need anything. So let's not bother trying to provide solutions, because he'll figure it out, right? As opposed to, solutions actually make the world easier to navigate, and it's nice to be able to have access to them, even if I don't always take advantage of them.
Mhm. Yeah, I always wondered why you didn't have a guide dog, because, I obviously love my animals and
Yes, but you're able to play with them when the harness is on, they're working. And I mean, that's another thing. I could have a guide dog. I've chosen not to have a guide dog, and that's been a choice. At first, the choice was motivated by the fact that my older sister hates dogs generally, and if I'd brought a guide dog into her house, she would have kicked me out and had me live in a hotel. But now I think that the choice about guide dog is, there's a tremendously long waiting list. There's people who need them more than I need them. And bringing a guide dog into a house with a 3-year-old may not always be the easiest thing, um, just because the 3-year-old then needs to understand, when is the dog working, when is the dog not working,
Mm,
right? And so as she gets older, that'll be a different calculus. But again, I have what I would call I have a functional vision profile that's sort of on the border of needing a dog versus not needing a dog. And I recognize, because I've done enough work in this space as a scientist and as somebody who now actually studies things like social determinants of health and population data science. Like I understand how this works, right? I understand how the sort of that notion of situational impacts to functional vision against sort of what your physiology and your neurology say. I get that. I'm on the fuzzy boundary of always needing something and only sometimes needing something, and so there may come a day where I have a dog, but it's not today, because I also understand how hard it is to train one, how hard it is to maintain a human guide dog relationship, and all sorts of other things, and so for me it's a choice about practicality, not a choice about necessity.
Well, if that day comes, I promise to behave myself and not love on the dog while they are working.
Noted. I will hold you to that.
Okay, well, I think that's a great place to stop our first video. So thank you for joining me, Mahadeo. I hope that everyone joins us next time, where we're going to dive into how Mahadeo's low vision has influenced his education, his career, and his career path. So I hope you join us. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.